Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Dixon's virtual Munch and Learn. I'm really glad you're here. And please take the time now to mute yourself if you're not already muted. And I want to let you know that this is going to be recorded and it will be added to our YouTube channel. So you can find it on our YouTube channel by going to our website and just clicking on the YouTube icon, or you can go to the Dixon at Home page and find all kinds of videos there. And during the talk, when a question pops into your head, just go ahead and go down to the bottom of the screen, put your cursor down there, and where it says chat, just click on that and type in your question. And then in the end, we'll have a Q&A. And so our speaker today is Ned Canty. He's the General Director of Opera Memphis. And before joining Opera Memphis as General Director in 2011, Ned Canty directed productions at dozens of companies in St. Louis, Santa Fe, New York City. And the New York Times has described his stage direction as having a startling combination of sensitivity and panache. And Opera News cited his work as evidence that the future of American opera is in good hands. Since joining Opera Memphis, Ned has led a restructuring of the 63-year-old company, expanding the season and launching the Midtown Opera Festival, an annual festival of chamber works. The signature program under his leadership is 30 Days of Opera, which has brought free performances to over 400,000 Memphians in more than 200 locations since its inception, including at the Dixon. And in 2014, he oversaw the commission and production of Ghosts of Crosstown, a series of 4 short operas inspired by the stories of Memphians who lived and worked at the iconic Sears Crosstown building between 1927 and 1989. And the piece premiered within the abandoned building in a version lit only with audience-carried flashlights before moving on to other venues, including the National Civil Rights Museum. And before discovering opera, Ned worked as an actor, director, and stuntman at Hartford Stage Company, the McCarter Theater, Six Flags Great Adventure, and the New York Renaissance Festival, among others. In 2005, he helped found the New York Television Festival and served as its director until 2010. He is the recipient of the Alliance for Nonprofit Excellence Innovation Award in 2016 and was the Inside Memphis Business CEO of the Year in 2017. He is currently serving his second term as a board member of Opera America. And of course, he lives in Memphis with his wife and a quantumly indeterminate number of dogs. So I'm going to turn it over to Ned Canty.
Wow, whoever that guy is, I don't know that I could live up to any of the stuff you just listed. So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Lindley pointed out, we've done a lot of 30 Days of Opera performances at the Dixon. I think we've done one at least every year of the 8 years that we've done the performance. And we've also done, just recently, we did a concert there in the Gardens with everyone socially distanced. And we have great plans for future performances. One of the rare silver linings of the pandemic is it does give us a little bit of time to plan ahead, which sometimes we get, it's sometimes hard to do that. So ever since my very first visit to the Dixon, when I met Kevin and he took me around and showed me some things, one of the first things that struck me was the porcelain collection, especially in terms of how many of the subjects of the porcelains came from either Shakespeare or especially the Italian tradition of commedia dell'arte. And commedia is really the root of Italian comic opera and really the root of all Western comedy in general, which is kind of the topic here. I am not at all an expert in porcelain. I know virtually nothing about it. So I can't tell you about, how they were made or the various types of places that were producing them. So if you're in for that, I apologize because you're not going to get it. I also should mention I'm doing this presentation from my mother's apartment in New York. I came out a few weeks ago to help her transition out of the hospital. So just in case I need to run over and let in a physical therapist or something, I apologize in advance. I think we're probably safe for the next hour or so, but in case I need to hop up, then I will. And what you're being treated to behind me is a small sample of her collection of what were thousands of nativities, all made by hand by artisans from around the world, including a couple here from New Mexican Santeros, hand carved. These are my favorite. And Kevin Sharp should definitely do a show showcasing these one of these years. We'll even sing during it. So without any further ado, I'm going to switch over. I'm going to share my screen here. And I would encourage everybody, if you are, would encourage everybody to switch up in the top right. You should have a choice between gallery view or speaker view. I would encourage you to switch to speaker view because we do have a few musical selections and you'll just get a much better view of those if you're in that view. So let's see. I'm also working on my travel laptop, which I never use. So my apologies if this is a little clunkier. So, so the name of this presentation is Harlequins and Pantaloons. Those are two of the phrases that are probably most commonly used still today that come out of the commedia tradition. But there are some others that we're going to get into here. Commedia dell'arte, all that means is it's theater of the professionals. The commedia, the word comedy, we tend to think of as being funny, but actually commedia did have some serious bits, but it was distinguished from amateur theatricals, church theatricals, things like that, by the fact that it was done by people who did it for a living. This was both a good thing and a bad thing. So really that's all the title means. And as we launch into this, going back and repurposing this, I originally gave a version of this presentation as part of an exploration of the Beaumarchais plays that formed the basis of Marriage of Figaro, The Barber of Seville, and a few other operas. So I originally did it based on that, but really to understand those operas, you need to understand the roots of commedia. So the past few days I've been going back and just refreshing it. And I vowed and promised everyone that this would be an escape from politics. I think one of the reasons why it provides particularly good escape from this precise moment of, as we all wait, whatever we wish the outcome to be, that this kind of discussion of the roots of comedy, for me, is a reminder of the fact that everybody laughs at pretty much the same things. That's an important thing. We all laugh when somebody gets tripped and falls down. It's just, we all laugh at a pie in the face. Those things transcend every culture, every political party, and they go back for thousands of years. And that, to me, that gives me great comfort, however you might feel about our situation. It's always good for me to be reminded that the things that make us similar, the things that we share, are 99.9% of our lives and DNA. It's just the 0.1% is what a lot of people can make money off of. So that's what we end up talking about and listening about. So putting that aside, really, if you want to talk about commedia, you have to go all the way back to the Greek theater. The Greek theater is not something I'm an expert on. I studied it in college, but it had both comedies and tragedies. The tragedies are the ones that we really remember. A lot of the comedies do not survive except in the form of versions from the Roman theater. Any of you who are fans of mythology know that the Roman gods are basically the Greek gods with different names. And I studied Greek for 4 years in high school, in a Jesuit high school. And my Greek teacher was fond of saying, the Romans looked at the Greeks and said, well, that seems good. And they just took it. And that was their gods. That was certainly their theater. So many of the plays that we still have, comedies of Plautus or Terence, are actually lost Greek comedies that they were merely translating and maybe localizing a little bit to Rome. After the fall of Rome, we get into the Dark Ages, and theater really suffered. Theater was essentially banned throughout for centuries because it was sinful. As any of us who love theater know, it's an extremely sinful thing that none of us should enjoy, but somehow we all do. So it was banned by the church, especially in Europe. There were pageants. There were, in places like England, mystery plays, biblical pageants. There was church music. There was church theater. That is the sort of bunch of other stuff that was happening during the Dark Ages. I'm just going to move. Give me 1 second. Click on something. The Commedia came out of that period, and it basically was troops of professional actors who went around Europe putting on shows. And and it really is, as I'm about to get into, the root of all other Western comedy. There are definitely comic traditions in many other countries. I doubt I'll have time for the anecdote, but the first show I directed in China was The Elixir of Love, which is very, very rooted in these commedia archetypes. And doing it with singers from China who had no experience of some of these archetypes in their comic traditions was incredibly interesting, though also incredibly difficult because we didn't have some of the same touchstones. But in terms of Western comedy, these roots are pretty strong. So the commedia types, you may have heard the phrase stock characters, and another way of putting that is archetypes. And one of the things I like to say is the primary difference between a stock character and an archetype is about $30 in ticket price, because we talk about archetypes when we're trying to be a little fancy. Commedia from the beginning was really an art form that happened in fairs, on street corners. It was, the performers were called vagabondi. We have the word vagabond, really, which has its roots back then because they were disreputable. They traveled around, nobody knew them, and a lot of the comedy was fairly vulgar. These stock characters that we talk about broke down into 4 different types. I'll talk a little bit as we go about the masks that were common as a part of commedia, which is one of the things that links them back to the Greek theater, which did use masks partly as character devices, partly as a way of projecting. They had these very clever little megaphones essentially built into them to help the actors spread their speech widely. But they did wear the masks. That's something that, for me, is somewhat less interesting than the actual characters, though there are lots of great, if you find yourself interested after this talk, there are lots of great resources online that really break down how the masks were developed over time to represent the different characters. So the first of these 4 major groups of characters that you would have, and most of the troops were roughly 10 folks, all of whom inhabited at different stages of their lives. Some, one type of these roles, people specialized, sometimes at an early age, sometimes they started out as one thing, graduated to another. The zani were the servants. Zani is where we get our word zany, in terms of madcap, silly. And the king of the zani, or the zany characters, is Harlequin. Harlequin in Italian, Arlecchino. He was the clever servant. He was a trickster. He was often in love with Columbina, and he is a character that recurs over and over and over throughout all of our traditions of comedy. You'll see him carrying that stick there. Excuse me, if I was doing this live, this is where I would start asking questions of the audience, but I'll refrain from that because it gets a little crazy on Zoom. Usually I would ask people if anyone knows what that was called. And what it was called was a slap, because it actually was a hinged piece of wood, right? It had that piece of wood, and then it had a little hinged piece so that you could go to whack somebody with it, not actually hit them, but this other piece of hinged wood would hit the main piece of wood and create a big clapping noise as if you had hit them. So when we talk about slapstick comedy, that is, again, one of the most common legacies of this piece of a word that we use all the time to describe a very physical sometimes sort of coarse style of comedy. And Arlecchino or Harlequin was the master of that. Now, how we went from Arlecchino, the sort of anti-madcap character, to Harlequin romances is one of those things that you'll need someone way smarter than me to explain, because I still have no idea. There are a lot of examples of Arlecchino in opera, but the most famous is the character of Figaro, the clever servant, someone who is always has a plan, sometimes wins, sometimes loses. In the end, usually wins. We are going to be hearing from Figaro a little bit later in the program, but there is a direct link between this character of Figaro to the character that many of us were introduced to opera with, Bugs Bunny, who is probably the most enduring Arlecchino or Harlequin character in our, at least American comedy. And of course, this is a still from The Rabbit of Seville, the wonderful award-winning cartoon in which he makes Elmer Fudd grow plants on his hair, because that's not actually hair tonic, it's some sort of gardening thing. It's a wonderful short. If you haven't seen it in a while, it always lifts my spirits. But this link between them is incredibly strong. Many other, any sort of clever servant, smarter than their masters. There are variants there. You might see them in Jeeves, of Jeeves and Wooster. You also see them in more serious pieces. We'll talk a little bit about that. His counterpart, Columbina, and there were many servants. These were just sort of the two primary ones. Columbina was down to earth. She was very outspoken. She often was the person who untangled the incredibly complicated knots that have been put into place by everybody else's machinations. She's often the only sane person in the room. And I used her in this example because she is a Susanna, if any of you know the opera The Marriage of Figaro. Susanna, who is marrying Figaro, she is a very pure style of Columbina. Today, it gets a little bit more mixed up, but you see elements of this role in characters like Anna from Downton Abbey, if any of you are fans, someone who is just down to earth as problem solver, figuring stuff out when everybody else is going nuts and the people upstairs are, can't figure anything out. It's the clever servants who are making it work. I would say, though, that in America, really where we see the legacy of Columbina is in the trope of what TVTropes.com calls ugly guy, sexy wife. And if you think of the vast number of sitcoms or comic movies in which men have women who greatly outclass them in every way, you really see Columbina. Of course, as someone who's married for 20 years, any of us men are so disgusting and irredeemable that any of us are lucky to find any woman to put up with us, let alone a sexy woman, in case my wife is watching right now. But this really is where we see this. And of course, Alice Cramden, in terms of her patience with Ralph's constant machinations, all of his crazy plans, her sanity, her perseverance, make her a perfect Columbina. So now we get around to the first of these Dixon porcelains. This is one called Harlequin and Columbina Dancing. You'll see that what Harlequin in this is wearing is actually very different than this, the checkered outfit that we often see him in. In fact, if I had just seen that one and didn't know the title of it, I would not have pegged that as a commedia piece. The other thing you'll notice is that by the time these porcelains were being created, these commedia roots that started in the 1500s in Italy had spread throughout Europe and had kind of married into local comic traditions that shared similar traits. So in Germany, some of these characters like Hanswurst, who was a character in German fairs, also very coarse, very vulgar. There was this native tradition that was similar. The Italians came in and we ended up with this marriage. So a lot of these porcelains are influenced by some of those Germanic characters who I have much less experience with, I will be the first to admit. So that brings us, as a reward for listening to me blather on for this long, that brings us to the first of our little musical interludes. So Dane Suarez, when he was first with us several years ago, played the role of Beppe in the opera Pagliacci. Pagliacci is an opera in which a traveling commedia troupe comes to a town and does a performance, but the character of Pagliaccio, before the performance begins, Pagliaccio discovers that his wife is cheating on him. Spoiler alert. Pagliaccio in the opera, Pagliaccio's character in the commedia often is being cheated on by his wife, often with Harlequin. And so the fact that this role that he needs to play every night is showing up in his real life drives Pagliaccio a little mad. But before we get around to that, and we're going to revisit our friend Pagliaccio later in the program, there is this wonderful serenade early in the show within a show at the end of Pagliacci, where Harlequin serenades Columbina. And Dane, I'm going to stop sharing so that you guys can take it away. And again, if you're in speaker view, you should be able to see Dane in his fullest.
Chiamando e sospirando aspetta il poverino. La tua faceta mostrami che io vo baciar senza tardar. La tua boccuccia, amor mi cruccia, mi sta tormentar. E mi sta tormentar. Colombina, schiudimi il finestrin ed è vicin di te chiamando e sospirando e povero Arlecchin. A te vicin
Jumping back in, I'm going to reshare my screen here. Okay. Very good. So thank you for that. You know, there's I was especially keen to ask Dane to sing that because, you know, he sang it when he was a younger tenor. As his voice has developed and gotten richer, he now sings the role of Canio, which he'll be doing later. Whoops. And that kind of graduation is exactly the kind of thing that happens within these commedia troupes. Someone who plays a Harlequin when he is young might graduate to one of the other roles. Why is this operating with hands? Sorry. From current slide. Oh, there we go. Very good. I'm usually a Mac person, but I'm having to do this on a PC, which is my travel computer, so a little slow. So the second of these four major groups of archetypes, so the innamorati, the young lovers. So the young lovers were distinct back in the day because they did not wear masks. Often their desire to be married and their very passionate love for each other, which was a little over the top sometimes, was also very sincere. We could see their faces, and the plots of a majority of commedia pieces revolved around the idea that these two young lovers wanted to get married and their parents or the older people in their lives were preventing it from happening. And again, that is the plot of maybe half of the movies and television you could find right now online. So that sort of thing is timeless. But it's also interesting to me when you look at, this is a lovely young Spanish lovers innamorati from the Dixon collection. Again, they just looking earnestly into each other's eyes, completely in love, staring at each other. And I think of what a professor in high school used to say, which is, true love is not staring at each other, it's staring in the same direction. And the fact that the young lovers are staring at each other, I think, is why they end up being not the center of the plot, but the thing that sets the plot in motion. They're really not who we're there for because they're also kind of dull. Some examples that you'll see, if anybody out there is a fan of the TV show Friends, when Friends began, Ross and Rachel were the young lovers. They were actually very bland compared to the wacky characters around them. Over time, they became weirder because TV relies on keeping lovers apart, as opposed to a single show where they can get married at the end of a play or a commedia scenario. Another great example, and this one has a specific operatic connection, if you look at the Marx Brothers, especially the movie A Night at the Opera, which has some Pagliacci references, some Trovatore references. One of these guys stands out, and that's Zeppo, second from the left, because he was the young lover. He didn't have a shtick. He was just the romantic lead, earnest, boring as heck. There's a reason why nobody remembers poor Zeppo, and certainly not poor Gummo. We only remember the other three of them because the straight people or the straight men, straight women are generally boring. Now, because of that today, since movies are usually driven by stars, often this idea of the boring couple getting married has kind of gone away, but it does still exist in movies like Bachelor Party, where the marriage is actually secondary and the people getting married are just kind of dull. So the third of our fourth categories are the vecchi, the old people. There are a couple of different types of them, but one of the main ones is Pantalone. This is the same painting that I was showing you earlier, where you see one of the innamorati, the young lovers, here with Pantalone. You can see he's got that wonderful beard, which would have been reflected in his mask when he was wearing a mask. Pantalone was primarily known for being very egotistical and full of himself, very greedy, and also a bit of a ladies' man, a self-styled ladies' man. This is a porcelain that I really love, and it's actually one of the ones that has looks the closest to the traditional Italian representation. You can see the red, almost Union suit that he's wearing, the little black cap, the black robe. Those are very, very strongly replicated in this particular one. Now, in terms of an older fellow who thinks he's God's gift to women, again, this is something that was funny 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, is still funny and will continue to be funny. The person I plucked out for this is, of course, Ralph Furley, as played by Don Knotts in Three's Company. I plucked him out of the hundreds and hundreds of examples, in part because this, when I first was learning about Pantalone years and years ago, he was the one who stuck in my mind because this was a show that I watched in the 70s when I was growing up. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I did. So I always think of him, egotistical, thinks he's God's gift to women, thinks he can do anything, greedy, very parsimonious in every way. A true Pantalone among and hundreds that you could find in popular culture. The other second major of the vecchi is Il Dottore, who was primarily known as a know-it-all. Now, sometimes he also was a bit of a rake, or at least liked to talk about his exploits, but primarily the thing that sets him apart is the fact that he was a know-it-all. So you'll see him in characters like Frasier, like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. You also see him in people like Cliff Clavin from Cheers, who really is one of my favorites. One of the interesting things about how we've taken commedia over time throughout Western culture is often we take characters who are not sympathetic and we make them sympathetic. Now that's something that TV does much more than other art forms. TV is a redemptive art form where over time villains have their rough edges sanded off, people are explained, people become more lovable over time. It's one of the things about TV that, apart from other art forms, the serialized storytelling medium. Cliff Clavin is an example of a very lovable iteration of this know-it-all, often wrong, but we do still love him. Final of these four groups is the Capitano, or the Capitani. There were many types. Primary thing about him is he is a braggart, says that he is an incredibly brave, incredibly skilled in battle, but in truth he is a coward, all right? That's what always in the end, all of these are lies. Falstaff is, if you're a fan of Shakespeare, is one of these characters. There are many of them in opera. They all go back to a Roman character named Miles Gloriosus, who it makes an appearance, and a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum in a kind of weird way. But this character of, let me at him, hold me back. No, I mean it, hold me back kind of thing is very common. And the other reason I chose Ralph Furley is that Don Knotts really stands out in my mind as an example of an incredibly gifted physical comedian whose face was about as close to a mask as you could possibly get, those big eyes that he would do, who was both a pantalone and earlier in his life, a capitano. Barney Fife constantly was talking about how rough and tough he was, but really, when it came right down to it, he was a coward. He would run in the other direction or hide behind Aunt Bee or whatever it took to protect himself. But again, lovable, understandable. We saw their, the Greeks would have said that we put ridiculous people on the stage to learn from their flaws and be better than them. I would say that today we often put flawed people on stage, on screen, whatever, to feel a little bit better about our own flaws. It doesn't actually make us want to change them. Sometimes it makes us think, well, at least they're not as bad as that guy. So I don't know if it's quite as, I don't know if comedy these days is quite the positive social force that the Greeks thought it could be. But I mean, look at that face. How can you not love him? And I chose this photo of, again, thousands online, because this is him trying to look rough and tough. This is, you could find 100 of him with his eyes popped out. There's a great one of him trying to figure out how to get a bullet in a gun. But this is the one of him trying to look tough and manly, guy you wouldn't want to mess with. So that is the Capitano. There are often within commedia, there would be spin-offs, regional spin-offs in Italy of these different types. And one of the big ones with the Capitano is a character named Scaramouche. This is a porcelain of that character, Scaramouche. He was kind of an odd hybrid. And what would sometimes happen is a very successful Capitano would have a name for himself and would put his own tweaks, his own little twists on the character, and would be so successful at it that others would start replicating it, and it would become its own character. Some of you may be familiar with the 1952 film Scaramouche, and if you are not, and you are a fan of sword fighting, and you have not seen this movie and The Court Jester and the Seahawk, how can you call yourself a fan of sword fighting if you haven't seen those three movies? Maybe throw in The Princess Bride. If you're looking for something to distract you further today, I don't know if you can stream this, but it is a wonderful sort of Scarlet Pimpernelli kind of movie in which the guy hides from the authorities by pretending to be an actor, Scaramouche, with a commedia troupe in France. Whoops. So I had another Scaramouche that I was going to put in there, and I think I never, I didn't actually do it. So I went, popped ahead a little bit. This is really just scratching the surface of all of this stuff. I am by no means an expert, but why I love talking about it, why I love reading about it is, when you delve into it, you really do see the idea of comedy as an iterative process. We build comedy on top of past comedy. So when you get into traditions like vaudeville in America, or even medicine shows, all of these things, you can find really strong roots stretching all the way back to the Commedia, and then further back to the Romans, to the Greeks, this this stream of comedy where everything can relate back to the thing before it. Any comedian that you show me, I bet you I could name 10 shows that they watched religiously as a kid that influenced their sense of comedy because of this nature. So I'll leave it at that because, as is usually the case, I've talked longer than I said that I would initially. This is a hard one for me to not go off on because I do love talking about it. So again, your reward for the second half of listening to me blather on about comedy is you get a little bit more opera in your life. I do want to thank our two Handorf company artists, Stamatis and Dane Suarez. As you can tell, they are in a quarantine bubble. They've been living together for several months now in an apartment off Overton Square. They're singing with karaoke tracks without a conductor, without any kind of feedback. So I just want to thank them. They really are indicative of a kind of show must go on ethos that I've been so thrilled to see in artists like them, in so many of our colleagues around the city who are just making sure that however we do it, we're still making art, we're still telling stories, we're still making music. I promised that I would come back to our friend Figaro as the main Harlequin character in his Bugs Bunny connection. So let's switch over. I will stop sharing and we can switch back over to Jake, who is going to sing one of the more famous arias in the canon. This is the entrance aria of Figaro in The Barber of Seville, in which he just brags. All he does in this entire aria is talk about how amazing he is, how good he is at his job. Whatever you need him to do, he can do it. He is the factotum for the entire city. And I will leave it at that and let him sing.
La 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 la. L'arco factotum della città largo. La 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 la. Presto bottega che la veggio presto. La 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 la. Ah, che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere per un barbiere di qualità, di qualità. Ah, bravo Figaro, bravissimo, bravo. La 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 la. Ragionatissimo per verità, bravo. La 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 la. Oh, fortunatissimo per verità. Fortunatissimo per verità. La 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 la. Pronto fa tutto l'anno per giorno, sempre rintorno, in giro sta, mire cuccagno per un barbiere, video più nobile non si fa. Rasori e pettini, lanciate e forbici al mio comando, tutto qui sta. Lanciate e forbici, rasori e pettini al mio comando, tutto qui sta. Fe la risorsa poi dal mestiere con la ronnetta, col cavaliere, con la ronnetta, la 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 la, col cavaliere, la 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 la, la la. Che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere per un barbiere di qualità. Tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono. Donne e ragazzi, vecchi fanciullo. Qua la parrucca, presto la barba, qua la sanguigna. Presto il biglietto, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono. Qua la parrucca, presto la barba, presto il biglietto. Ehi, Figaro! Figaro, Figaro, Firo, 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 Figaro! Ahimè, che furia, ahimè, che folla! Uno alla volta, per carità, per carità, per carità! Uno alla volta, uno alla volta, uno alla volta, per carità! Figaro! Son qua! Figaro! Son qua! Figaro qua! Figaro là! Figaro qua! Figaro là! Figaro su! Figaro giù! Figaro su! Figaro giù! Pronto, prontissimo, son come un fulmine, sono i factori della città! Della città! Della città! Della città! Della città! Oh, bravo Figaro, bravissimo, oh, bravo Figaro, bravissimo, devo tu, non mancherò, la 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 devo tu, non mancherò, sono il factotum della città, sono il factotum della città, della città. I love città.
All right, I'm going to share. I have one last one. There's a character that I have not talked about much yet, which is Pagliacci. And he's our last character. And I left him for last because he's, again, another great example of how much these, these commedia characters really are just the trunk of a tree that branches out into all kinds of places. So this character of Pagliacci, you can see him on the far left dressed as he's often dressed in the opera with that mask, is the descendant, cousin, brother, father of Pulcinella most immediately, but also Pierrot, who became very melancholic, Petrushka in Russia, and most violently and weirdly, Punch, the hand puppet character in Punch and Judy shows. You know, the Italian comedy first came to England about a decade or two before Shakespeare started writing, which is why we see so many of these tropes, so many of these characters in his comedies, especially his early comedies like Love's Labour's Lost is filled with commedia-style characters. But this character, you know, is harder to pin down. He was, his origins, or his ancestors have gone in so many different directions. He is a harder character to say, oh, he was this, he was that, he was the other. But there, I think if there was one thing that I came back to, again, on the very wonderful site, tvtropes.com, which is far more intelligent and academic than it sounds, is a description of him as a chew toy, someone who fate is just constantly battering. He never wins. And you know, that this character of Pagliacci in the opera, of course, his commedia character Canio, who is the male lead in the opera, his character Pagliacci never wins. He always loses the girl. And when he finds out over the course of the opera that his wife, who plays his wife in the show, is also cheating on him, and realizes that he has to go on stage still. He has to put on the makeup. This was written at a period in Italy where makeup had overtaken masks. He still needs to go on stage. He still needs to be a clown. He still needs to make people laugh, even though he is crying inside. You know, that is the genesis of a million velvet paintings of crying clowns is this opera and this particular moment in this opera as now sung by Dane Suarez.
Recitar mentre preso dal delirio non so più quel che dico e quel che faccio, eppure dopo sforzati, ma sei tu forse un uomo? Tu sei Pagliaccio?
Thank you, Dane. Thank you, thank you. So I didn't quite leave quite as much time for Q&A as I said, but I know we started a few minutes late, so only over by 5, which for me is pretty good.
Well, thank you. That was amazing. So much information, and the singing was fantastic. We're so lucky to have you as singers and to have Opera Memphis here. There are just a couple of questions. Mainly, it's just everyone telling Dane and Jake and Ned what an amazing job they're doing. But I was curious, Ned, if there is a commedia character that you haven't seen in porcelain that you would love to see in porcelain.
Well, I haven't actually seen a Pagliaccio. I'm sure that there might be one, but I haven't seen one in the collection. There were a couple of pieces in the collection that it just kind of, I didn't know enough about how they'd gone from one thing to another. I think there's also a lesser known servant called Brigella, who is like a less lovable Harlequin, who is kind of a mean servant. For me, the Edmund Blackadder in the wonderful Blackadder TV series is sort of the example of that particular character. But yeah, I think all of them they capture these moments, and I would love to see if there were any porcelains that have them masked rather than unmasked. The roots of Commedia were so local. I didn't get into some of the stuff, but like the doctor had a Bolognese accent, which was very specific because that's where the medical school was. And so that was part of the joke, the same way that if I was talking to you like, hey, oh, hey, you know, we would make certain assumptions about my New York accent. That, or, you know, Boston accent might indicate learning or something. There was a ton of that throughout Commedia, which is part of why when it went to other countries, they would localize it there. So I think, you know, to see if there were any masked ones that match that kind of localized German version of it, or Austrian version of it, I would be curious to see that.
Well, we'll have to do some research on that for you. And also, it was commented, I think Chantel commented, I'm sure others agree that we love the pop culture references and knowing what the more current day sort of versions of these characters are. And I don't really watch reality TV, but do you think that in reality TV, they purposefully find people that fit these characters to be in reality TV also?
So yeah, as you mentioned early on, I spent 5 years running a TV festival. And so a lot of the people, I was the only one actually on the senior staff who did not come from a TV background. I came from a theater background. And most of my colleagues there had worked in some capacity or other on Wife Swap or some of the other, you know, reality shows, either in England or in the States. And, you know, they are cast and directed as much as anything else. I mean, the reality TV was, the term of art that we all preferred was non-scripted, because it basically was people trying to direct non-trained actors to have moments that they could then edit together. So, you know, behind the scenes of every reality TV show, there's somebody going, hey, why don't you go over and talk to so-and-so about the fact that they ate all your yogurt? You know, that they're trying to get people to have a fight or do whatever. So, you know, all of that. And then the editing process and the addition of music allows you to take almost any scene and kind of tell the story that you want. So when they cast these reality shows, yeah, they are looking for certain types. And, you know, a lot of my friends who had done reality TV or unscripted for a while were trying desperately to get out of it because there's a kind of inherent amorality to it that was heating up their souls. So I say that with, I have watched some as very guilty pleasures. But yeah, all of that stuff, all of those types. And we put people into archetypes, you know, you see it in every commercial as archetypes. It's why opera has such a bad rep in the media, because there is an archetype of an opera lover who eats Grey Poupon straight from the jar and wears a top hat in the shower. And that's the archetype that commercial creators have decided is the opera lover archetype. So it's very natural for us to do this. The fun thing for me is that comedy often comes from subverting expectations. And so for 10 years here in Memphis, I've been trying to subvert that expectation, which sometimes I succeed at, but it's always a lot of fun to try.
Well, very good. Well, we just have, I've got a couple of comments to kind of end things with. Norma Montesi, who is one of our staff members, she says, incredible, what a treat. Thank you so much. And there are many other comments like that along the way, including from Paul saying, fantastic, thank you. But I want to end with Kevin Sharp. As you guys know, is the Dixon director. He says, Lindley, let's bring our opera singers to my next Munch and Learn. Wow, really awesome presentation. Ned really delivers.
Oh, go on.
So, you know, next Kevin Sharp Munch and Learn, you know, about whatever, we just need opera.
Ned, if we wanted to know more about this, have you some suggestions of where we can look or some books?
About Commedia, there is actually a fairly inexpensive Dover book that's a little dry, but it's got a lot of great, it shows the families really well. It's just called The Italian Comedy. In terms of another, you know, most of the interesting other media representations I know of are more film than academic. I'm sure they're out there, I just don't necessarily have a favorite.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we will kind of end things out. If anybody wants to unmute and give one last thank you or bravo or anything else, you're welcome to for the next little while before I end everything. So
Lindley,
go.
hey,
Thank you.
Lindley, it's Paul. Are those porcelains on view now at the Dixon?
They are in the Stout Gallery.
Thank you.
With LED lights.
Okay.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Annette. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been really soothing for the soul. Thank you
Thank-
so much.
That's number one priority these days. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, wonderful.
Okay, so I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you all so much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bravissima.